Rosalind Vane was sold to the Duke of Blackmere in August for £4,000 to settle a church debt her uncle could not pay. The hired coach stopped in the gravel drive of Blackmere Castle on the hottest afternoon of the year. She stepped out wearing a high-necked pale grey dress and a heavy wool shawl wrapped twice around her shoulders and pinned at the collarbone with a plain brass clasp, and she did not loosen the pin. The afternoon heat sat thick on the lawns. The footmen had thrown open every window in the east wing by noon, and the roses along the south wall were giving off heat of their own, all that heavy summer scent pressed flat by the sun. The shawl was wrong for August. Every servant in the drive noticed. None of them spoke. She picked up her own bag. The footman moved to take it, and she released it to him, because standing in the gravel with her own luggage would embarrass the household, and she had no interest in that. She walked through the front door and into the entrance hall, and she stood there with her back close to the wall and her hands folded in front of her, and she waited. She was 23 years old. She was the new Duchess of Blackmere. She had not chosen to be. That was the plain truth of it, and she had known it since the April morning. Her uncle Gerald Vane sat down across from her in the rectory's front parlour, laced his fingers on the table, and told her she was to be married by the end of the month to a duke in Derbyshire, whose name she had never heard. He had presented it as a kindness. He had called it a fortunate arrangement. He had explained, in the calm, measured voice he used for announcements that were not open to discussion, that she was 23 years old with no fortune and no prospects, and that a rector's niece with her circumstances should be grateful for any offer of this quality. He had not mentioned the £4,000. Not directly. He had mentioned in passing a church debt that was being resolved, and she had understood, because she was her father's daughter, and she knew how to listen to what was left unsaid, that she was the resolution. She had looked at the window for a long time after he finished speaking. Then she had thanked him and gone upstairs to her room and sat on the edge of the bed and understood that she had no choice, and that she would not be having this choice. What was the woman in the shawl hiding? Gerald Vane had been the rector of St. Clement's Parish in Ashbourne for 12 years, a position he had obtained with considerable assistance from his brother Thomas, Rosalind's father, who had been the assistant rector there for many years before. When Thomas Vane died of a winter fever in the year Rosalind was 18, Gerald stepped fully into the living and the rectory house, and Rosalind stepped into the position of unmarried dependent, which was the only position available to a young woman with no money and no family, beyond an uncle who had already decided what she was worth. What she was worth, it turned out, was the cost of his silence. But Rosalind had inherited something from her father that Gerald Vane had not adequately accounted for. Thomas Vane had loved accounts the way other men love horses or poetry, with genuine pleasure, with aesthetic appreciation for their precision, with a quiet craftsman's satisfaction when a column of figures resolved cleanly and told the truth. He had kept the parish accounts for 20 years with a care that bordered on devotion, and when Rosalind was old enough to sit beside him at the desk and follow the numbers with her finger, he had taught her to do the same. A lie in a ledger, he had told her once, on an autumn afternoon when she was 12, and the firelight made the columns blur if she sat too close, does not announce itself. It sits quietly between two honest numbers and hopes you will not notice, but the numbers around it are always uncomfortable, too clean, too round. Look for places where a total adds up too neatly when it should have a remainder. That is where something is wrong. She had been better at it than he expected. Not just at finding arithmetic errors, which was the easy part, but at reading the logic of a set of accounts as a narrative, understanding what the money was supposed to do, what movement made sense given the size of the parish, and where the story stopped making sense. By the time she was 17, she had found 2 genuine irregularities in the quarterly reports, both innocent miscalculations that would have caused embarrassment at the bishop's audit. Her father had been pleased, and then quietly corrected them, and had told her she had a remarkable eye, and that she should never be without a ledger to read if she could help it. He died in February. Gerald came in March. And in the 4 years between Thomas Vane's death and the April morning of the announcement, Rosalind had learned what the position of unmarried dependent actually required. It required silence, stillness, a specific practiced composure in company that looked like modesty and functioned as armour. It required never speaking at table unless spoken to, never meeting a guest's eyes directly, never asking questions in mixed company about anything that might suggest she had opinions. When she failed at any of these requirements, Gerald chose his correction carefully and applied it carefully, and the marks it left were in places covered by clothing. It had started the first winter after Thomas died. A single incident that she had told herself was an aberration, a man under pressure, a thing that would not happen again. By the second year, she understood it was not an aberration. It was policy. Gerald Vane was a man who believed that the order of a household required maintenance, and that maintenance applied to a woman under his roof was his right and his responsibility. He was not drunk when he did it. He was not impulsive. He was deliberate and precise, and the only mercy was that he was not imaginative. She had stopped flinching. That had taken 2 years. After she stopped flinching, she started watching. Everything. All of it. The patterns of when he was safe and when he was not. The movements of his household. The gaps in his attention. She went through every drawer she was not supposed to touch. Not from defiance, from the hunger that comes when information is your only currency. In a locked box under Gerald's study desk, opened with a hairpin on a Sunday morning when he was at the 11 o'clock service, she had found a second set of ledger books. The official accounts, the ones on the open shelf that the bishop's office reviewed, were orderly and clean. The books in the locked box were different in a specific way that she recognized immediately, the same numbers but altered. Small reductions in deposit totals recorded in a hand that was almost but not quite Gerald's, carefully achieved by a man who understood that the easiest change to miss is the one that looks almost right. She had gone back to the box 3 times over 6 months, always on Sunday, always with the hairpin, always with the notebook she kept in the lining of her winter coat. By the time she had finished, she understood the full shape of it. Gerald Vane had been taking money from St. Clement's Parish for at least 8 years, not all at once, never dramatically, but in the steady, patient increments of a man who understood that small amounts compound over time into large ones. The families of Ashbourne had been tithing to their church, and Gerald had been redirecting a portion of those tithes to himself, month by month, year by year, and the official record said nothing had happened. The notebook in the coat lining said otherwise. She had not known what to do with this information. A young woman who produced evidence she had obtained from a locked box she was not supposed to enter would not be believed. She would be accused of fabrication, or worse. She had no standing, no allies, no one to tell. So she had kept the notebook and said nothing and waited, with the specific patience of a person who has learned that the only advantage available to them is the long view. Then April came, and the bishop's accountant arrived at St. Clement's, and the game came to an end for Gerald, and he solved his problem the way men like him always solve problems. He used someone who had no standing to refuse him. Lady Philippa Ashford arrived at the rectory 2 days before the wedding. She was the Duke's sister, 30 years old, unmarried by design, with a long, fine face and the posture of a woman who had never once in her life been required to make herself small. She sat across from Rosalind in the front parlour and looked at her the way an appraiser looks at an item of uncertain provenance. Not hostile, not warm, simply evaluating. "I want to be honest with you," Philippa said. Her voice was pleasant and careful. It was the pleasantness of a woman who had learned that a pleasant delivery makes a knife harder to see coming. "My brother is not marrying you because he selected you. He is marrying you because his solicitors identified a possible candidate for an arrangement he agreed to at a distance, and you happened to be available." "I am aware of the circumstances," Rosalind said. She kept her hands folded and her eyes level. "I wonder if you are aware of all of them." Philippa picked up the teacup, considered it, set it down. "My brother lost his wife 4 years ago. He has managed very well without anyone playing the part of Duchess since then, because I have been here. I am his family. I understand this house. I have no particular interest in watching a woman of your background and your means arrive here, and decide that she has a role beyond what was agreed." She paused. "So, I will say plainly, stay quiet, stay out of the way, do not involve yourself in his affairs or his household management, and we will have no difficulty. Make yourself ambitious, and I will make Blackmere very unpleasant for you." Rosalind looked at her steadily. "Thank you for the warning," she said. Philippa's eyes went cooler. She had expected the warning to land differently, with visible fear or visible submission. She had not expected that particular tone, which was not challenge, but which was absolutely not deference either. Philippa stood, looked at the shawl Rosalind was wearing against the April chill, and said, "That is not suitable for a duchess. I will arrange something appropriate." She left. The something appropriate never arrived. Rosalind had not expected it to. She packed her trunk that evening and put the notebook at the bottom beneath her father's prayer book, and went to sleep in the rectory for the last time. The Duke of Blackmere arrived at his own entrance hall 40 minutes after Rosalind did. She heard him before she saw him. Not his voice. She heard the change in the room. The footman beside the door straightened without a command. Agnes, the little maid who had been assigned to wait with Rosalind, stepped back 2 careful paces. The housekeeper, Mrs. Hatton, a stout woman with a kind, steady face, turned to face the door with an expression of someone who has arranged her posture in a specific way. Even the air in the hall seemed to rearrange itself, pulling toward the entrance. Then he came through the door. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, with dark hair that had gone silver at the temples 10 years too early. He could not have been older than 33. He was still in riding clothes. He moved with the economy of a man who did not waste motion, and he had the look of someone who had been outdoors all day and preferred it to any room. His eyes, when they crossed the hall and found her, were grey, the kind of grey that gives no warmth and makes no promise. He walked toward her, and she did not step forward. Her body had learned over years that moving toward an approaching man was a calculation that needed to be made carefully. He stopped 2 feet from her. "Miss Vane." His voice was low and even. "I apologize for the delay. My steward informed me of your arrival late." "It is no trouble, Your Grace," she said. He looked at her for a moment, not an assessment, more the look of someone trying to read a page that has been turned face down. Then he looked at Mrs. Hatton. "Are Miss Vane's rooms prepared?" "Yes, Your Grace." "Good." Back to Rosalind. "My solicitor, Mr. Hale, will call tomorrow to complete the formal documents. The ceremony is Friday. If you require anything in the meantime, Mrs. Hatton will assist you." He was already turning. "Your Grace," she said. He turned back. Nothing moved in his face. "I was told there would be a household account for me to review before the ceremony. Is that arrangement still in place?" He was still for a moment. "It is not the standard arrangement for a woman in your position." "I know." She kept her voice level and her hands quiet. "My father kept the parish accounts for 20 years, and I helped him. I would like to understand what I am entering." The grey eyes shifted, a small recalibration, visible in the brief stillness of his face. She had not intended to surprise him, but she had. "I will arrange it with Mr. Hale," he said, after a pause. She nodded. "Thank you." He left the hall. She stood still until she was certain she was composed, and then she followed Agnes upstairs, and in her room with the door closed she pressed her back against the wall and breathed slowly until her hands stopped shaking. Friday came. The church was small and the ceremony was brief. She said the words clearly. He said the words steadily and did not look at her during the vows. The ring was gold with a dark blue stone. When the rector pronounced them married, the Duke offered his arm to walk out and she took it, and they walked together down the aisle in a silence so complete it had its own texture. She was the Duchess of Blackmere. She did not feel anything at all, except the weight of the ring and the specific alertness of being in a new and unfamiliar house with new and unfamiliar rules. If you are enjoying this story, please subscribe and hit the bell. Come back for the next chapter. You will not want to miss what happens when those 12 guests arrive for dinner. The first 3 weeks at Blackmere Castle taught Rosalind the architecture of her new situation. Breakfast was at 8. The Duke appeared at the main table on Wednesdays and Saturdays. On those mornings he was courteous in the way of a man performing a careful and practiced duty. He asked whether she had slept well. He noted the weather. He read correspondence while the coffee was served. She answered in the same register. They were 2 people navigating a contract with the minimum required contact, observing the terms, generating no friction. On the Wednesday of the first week, she asked Mrs. Hatton a question about the kitchen garden accounts, and he looked up from his correspondence. He did not say anything. He went back to reading. But he had looked up, and he had stayed looking for a moment longer than the question warranted. She spent her mornings in the library, which was enormous, and had not been properly organised in decades. The shelves held everything from parish histories to natural philosophy to agricultural manuals, shelved by no system she could identify, and the project of bringing order to them gave her something real to do with her hands and her mind. The afternoons she walked in the East Garden, always wearing the shawl. In the evenings she dined alone when the Duke was out, and with him when he was in, and the silence at dinner was the specific silence of 2 people who are not hostile to each other, and have not yet found the exact words that would make the space between them a conversation. Lady Philippa was in residence at a house in the village 2 miles from the castle, which meant she came to Blackmere whenever she chose, which she did frequently. She arrived in the mornings, took up her usual chair in the morning room, received the mail she apparently still received at the castle's address, and sat with the composed authority of someone who has never been told that a room belonged to anyone else. On the 5th day, she came to the morning room where Rosalind was reading and sat down across from her and looked at the shawl. "Still wearing that?" she said pleasantly. "I find it comfortable," Rosalind said, without looking up. "In this heat." Philippa's tone was mild. The mildness was its own particular cruelty. "The maids are talking. They think you are hiding something unfortunate." "Then they must have very little to think about," Rosalind said. Philippa smiled. Her eyes did not participate. She picked up a small porcelain figurine from the side table. A shepherd in blue and white that Rosalind had already noticed was positioned with great precision, clearly placed there by someone who cared about its exact location, turned it over, set it down an inch from where it had been. Rosalind saw it. She said nothing. "My brother has invited 12 guests for dinner in 2 weeks," Philippa said. "You will be expected to act as hostess. I'm informing you in advance because it would embarrass Marcus if you got it wrong." "I'm capable of hosting a dinner," Rosalind said. "I'm sure you have a very good sense of what the Ashbourne Rectory considered adequate for a dinner party." Philippa stood, smoothed her dress with the unhurried care of a woman who has never once been required to hurry. "This is not the Ashbourne Rectory." After she left, Rosalind sat still for 60 seconds, breathing steadily, naming the feeling precisely so it would not show. Anger, not shame. She would not let it be shame. She crossed the room and moved the figurine back to its original position. On the Wednesday of the 2nd week, the quarterly household accounts were laid out on the desk in the estate office, and Rosalind sat beside Mr. Hollis, the steward, and went through them as the Duke had arranged. She had been doing this weekly, a small domestic authority granted without comment, and she had learned the patterns of the house's expenditures the way she had learned the rectory's, by reading the numbers not just as figures, but as a story of how a household moved through the world. She found the error in the coal ledger on a Tuesday morning, 3rd week. The supplier had invoiced for 32 loads delivered in May, June, and July. The delivery receipts showed 29. The discrepancy had been carried forward uncorrected through 3 months of accounts, compounding in a minor but specific way, and the sum in question was £43 overcharged against the estate. "Mr. Hollis," she said, "this entry here." The steward bent over the page, following her finger. He went very still. "That has been carried from May," he said quietly. "It has. I would like to write to the supplier today requesting a corrected invoice." She paused. "And I would like to see the July and August delivery records as well, to confirm the pattern does not continue." Hollis looked at her with an expression she took a moment to identify. It was respect, careful, measured, the kind a professional man extends to another professional. He nodded once. "I will pull them this afternoon, Your Grace." She was addressed as Your Grace for the first time by someone who meant it. The Duke appeared in the estate office doorway 20 minutes later. He had clearly come looking for something else and found her instead. He looked at the spread of accounts on the desk, then at her, and the recalibration she had seen twice before moved across his face again. "Mr. Hollis tells me you found an accounting error," he said. "A billing discrepancy. £43 compounded across 3 months. She kept her voice matter-of-fact. "I have written to the supplier. I expect they will correct it without difficulty." He came fully into the room and stood at the corner of the desk and looked at the ledger for a long moment, not at her. "Mr. Hollis has managed this estate for 22 years, he said, his predecessor before him for 30. "Neither of them was looking for this kind of error," she said. "They would have been watching for fraud. This is not fraud. It is a supplier taking advantage of inattention. Different thing entirely." He was quiet. She had the sense that he was deciding something, though she could not have said what. Then the corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile, the ghost of one, involuntary and immediately controlled, gone in a second. She saw it and filed it away and showed nothing. That evening at dinner he asked her about the library. She told him about the cataloguing project, the organisational problem, the absence of any logical system in the existing shelves. He listened. He answered. He asked a second question, which led to a third. They had, for the first time, a genuine exchange of words that was not the performance of courtesy. It lasted 11 minutes. She counted, without meaning to. She did not sleep for a long time that night. She lay on her side in the dark and felt something she had not felt in years, something small and fragile and warm that she did not dare name, because naming it would require acknowledging she was coming to care about the outcome. She refused to acknowledge that yet. The shawl was on the chair by the window. She had not taken it off once in 3 weeks, not even in this room with the door locked and Agnes gone for the night, because taking it off meant the possibility of seeing what was on her back, and she was not ready for that. Not yet. The next morning at breakfast he was reading correspondence before she sat down, and he did not look up when she came in. He said good morning without raising his eyes from the page. When she answered, he nodded once and turned to the next letter. She sat and poured her own coffee. The 11 minutes of the night before seemed to belong to a different week. She recognized what he was doing because she had done it herself, in Gerald's house, in the years when showing anything was risky. A man who had let something slip, coming back to collect it. She was not angry. She understood it. She just could not decide whether understanding it was better or worse than not. By Wednesday, he was still at the same formal distance, a nod in the corridor, a courteous question about whether she had everything she required, and then he was past her and gone. She stood in the corridor for a moment after he left and felt the small, specific sting of it. Not humiliation, just the quiet hurt of a door she had begun to hope might stay open, closing again. She told herself it was useful information, that a man who withdrew this deliberately had something to withdraw from. She went back to the library and opened her catalogue notes and did not allow herself to think about it further. The parish account books arrived later that same week, in a package from a London firm of solicitors called Brant and Morrow, addressed to the Duke. Rosalind had noticed this firm's letterhead on 3 prior pieces of correspondence, and observed that the Duke's replies, which she saw being sealed in the office for dispatch, were longer than his usual letters. He was investigating something. She had known it was connected to the debt since the 2nd week, when Hollis mentioned in passing that the Duke had found certain aspects of the parish debt arrangement irregular, and had engaged a London firm to look into it before agreeing to the marriage terms. Hollis had said it without particular emphasis, the way a careful man mentions something he expects you already know. She had not asked. She had waited. On Thursday, he came to the library doorway and stood there until she looked up. "I would like to speak with you," he said. "In the study." His study was in the north wing, a large room in deliberate disorder, papers organised by a private system only he understood, maps pinned to one wall, a desk that held 3 levels of activity at once. He gestured to the chair across from him and sat down and put a folder on the desk between them. "I want to show you something," he said, "and I want you to tell me what you see." He opened the folder and slid the papers across. They were parish accounts, St. Clement's, Ashbourne, 8 years of them. Rosalind went very still. She knew these accounts. She had sat in Gerald's locked study on Sunday mornings and read these exact figures, or the figures they were supposed to represent before Gerald had adjusted them to say what he needed them to say. These were the official versions, the ones submitted to the bishop's auditors, clean and orderly and lying. She knew the lies by their specific shape, the way a forgery expert knows a forged signature by the pressure of the pen. She went through the columns. It took her 8 minutes. She pointed to 3 distinct places where deposit totals did not correspond to the entry records that should have produced them, where a column had been reduced by a number small enough to miss on a single review, but consistent enough, across years, to constitute a pattern. "These are not errors," she said. Her voice came out even. She was proud of that. "The alterations are deliberate. This column here, 4 years back," she pointed, "is corrected in the same hand as this one from 2 years later. The same person made both changes. They knew exactly what they were doing." He watched her face. "You have seen something like this before." It was not a question. She looked up. His grey eyes were steady on her, not accusatory, not probing, something older and quieter than that, the look of a man who has been holding a question for a long time and has finally found the person who can answer it. "My uncle," she said. One sentence. She let it stay between them. He nodded once, slowly. "Brant and Morrow have been investigating the source of the parish debt since the spring. Your uncle directed the bishop's accountant to a different set of books when the audit was conducted in April. The £4,000 debt was not the origin of the irregularity. It was the point at which the irregularity could no longer be hidden." He paused. "They believe the total amount removed from the parish over 12 years is closer to £11,000. Rosalind sat with that for a moment. £11,000. Over 12 years. Her father had been alive for 4 of those 12 years. Thomas Vane had sat at his desk on autumn afternoons, and taught his daughter to read columns and look for lies, and the whole time his brother had been building a lie in the very accounts Thomas was protecting. She put her hands flat on the desk. The cold of the wood was steady against her palms. "He sold me," she said, "to keep this from being found." "Yes," the Duke said quietly. "I believe so." She held herself still. She was grieving something. She recognized, not her own situation, not the arrangement or the marriage or the lost choice, but her father. She was grieving the insult to her father's work, to the families in Ashbourne who had given their tithes in good faith, to the specific integrity that Thomas Vane had built his life around, and that his brother had been quietly dismantling all along. The Duke stood and walked around the desk and stopped beside her chair. He did not touch her. He simply stood there, present, the way a person stands when they cannot fix what has happened but are determined not to leave. "There is something else," he said. His voice had changed, lower and less controlled than usual. She looked up. "My first wife," he said. "Her name was Catherine Pemberley. We were married in 1820. He stopped. She waited. Her father was a man who managed his household with methods I became aware of before the wedding. I told myself that once she was under my roof she would be safe, that removing her from the situation was sufficient. His jaw tightened. She was safe for 2 years. She died in 1822 in childbed. The child did not survive. The room held the silence. "I was not there when it happened," he said. "I had been called away on an estate matter, and I was 3 days' ride from home, and by the time I arrived she was already gone." He was looking at the window, his profile to her, very still. "In the years since, I have thought often about the weeks before she died, whether I could have seen something earlier, whether I was too careful about not overstepping when what was needed was not care but speed." Rosalind looked at him, the line of his jaw, the set of his shoulders, the careful control of a man who has built walls around something that is still raw after 4 years, and is now, for reasons she could not fully explain, opening one of those walls. "You have been watching," she said quietly, "to see whether you were too late again." He turned and looked at her directly, and for a moment the control he wore like a second skin was simply not there. She could see the guilt in his face, the specific guilt of a man who had recognized a thing too late before and was recognizing it again, and this time could not put it away as uncertainty. "When you arrived," he said, "in August in that shawl, I knew something was wrong. I chose not to ask." He paused. "I told myself it was not my place, that I would be overstepping." The jaw tightened again. "I will not make the same decision twice." She held his gaze for a long, steady moment. The arrangement they had been navigating for 3 weeks, 2 strangers in a formal contract, courteous and distant and careful, had become something different. She could feel the change the way you feel the pressure drop before a storm. Not here yet, but coming. She was not ready for this. She was also, she was beginning to understand, already in it. "I have a notebook," she said, after a moment. She kept her voice even. "In my room, I kept records of the discrepancies I found in Gerald's hidden accounts. I did not know, at the time, what to do with them." She looked at the folder on the desk. "I think I know now." He was still for a long moment. Then, "We will need your notebook." The next morning, Hollis informed her, with the quiet precision of someone delivering information he had been instructed to deliver carefully, that a second lock had been installed on her bedroom door overnight, and that Agnes had been given instructions to report only to Rosalind herself about her mistress's movements and schedule. The Duke had not mentioned it to her. He had simply done it. She stood in the corridor for a moment, holding that fact, and felt the fragile, unnamed thing in her chest move again, more insistently this time. Then she went about the day. Lady Philippa found the letter on a Monday. Rosalind had written to Mr. Arthur Pendlebury of Bath, her father's old friend, a solicitor who had handled Thomas Vane's small estate, and who, she had calculated, would be both discreet and capable of acting as an additional channel for the evidence she and the Duke were assembling. The letter was sealed and addressed and left on the hall table to go out with the morning post, because that was where outgoing correspondence was left, and she had no reason, at the time, to think it required special handling. Philippa arrived at 7 in the morning. She had arrived early before. The hall table was not locked. The letter to Bath was on it when she arrived and gone when she left, and Agnes, who had better instincts than her position usually required, had seen it. Philippa found Rosalind in the East Garden that afternoon. She came without her pleasant surface, which was the first thing Rosalind noticed. Philippa's pleasantness was a weapon she maintained with considerable discipline, and its absence meant the discipline had slipped. She was genuinely angry. The anger had the specific quality of someone who has been trying to stay ahead of a situation and just realised they are behind it. She stopped on the garden path and held up the letter, resealed, but visibly so. "You are writing to solicitors in Bath," she said, "about the parish accounts." "That is a private letter," Rosalind said. "You are trying to use your own family's criminal behaviour as a tool," Philippa said, and now the anger was audible, controlled, but there. "You came into this house with an agenda. You have been positioning yourself as indispensable, the household accounts, the library, the convenient discovery of the billing error, all of it building toward this. You want to make Marcus feel he owes you something. You want to make yourself appear the wronged party and your uncle the villain, and use the whole thing to establish yourself here permanently." Rosalind looked at her steadily. "Your brother already knows about the debt. He hired Brant and Morrow 6 weeks before our wedding. I did not bring this to him. He brought it to me." Philippa's face did something complicated. The confidence in it shifted. She had not known that. "You are lying," she said. "I am not." Philippa stepped forward. Rosalind did not step back. "If you attempt to use this evidence in any public setting," Philippa said, "I will tell every guest at that dinner next week exactly what you are. A rector's charity case who married a duke to escape a scandal she helped engineer. I will tell them your uncle sold you because no one else wanted you. I will tell them—" "Lady Philippa," Rosalind's voice dropped. It did not rise. "I have been told worse things by people with better standing to say them. You will not frighten me with this." Philippa went still. "And if you open my correspondence again," Rosalind said, "I will tell your brother, and you will explain to him, in front of me, why you read a sealed letter from his wife." Philippa left without speaking. Agnes was at the top of the stairs when Rosalind came back through the garden door. She was not supposed to be there. She had been assigned to the linen room that afternoon, but she was standing at the top of the stairs holding a glass of cold water, with the careful expression of someone who had been listening from a window she had forgotten to close, and who was not going to pretend otherwise. She held out the glass and said nothing. No questions, no false comfort, no offer of reassurance she had no standing to give. Just the cold water on a hot August afternoon, and a look that said she had heard enough and had decided where she stood. Rosalind took the glass. She drank half of it. "Thank you, Agnes," she said. Agnes nodded and went back about her work. Rosalind walked back through the garden door, up the stairs into her room, and sat on the edge of the bed with her hands on her knees, and allowed herself to feel the full weight of everything, all of it, all at once. It came out as grief, not tears yet, something before tears, a pressure built up behind the ribs, the specific weight of knowing that the person who had created the situation had never once paid for it and might not. The weight of being the smallest piece in a very large problem, the weight of 4 years of silence and 7 months of waiting, and the specific unbearable loneliness of not being known. Not by anyone. Being the woman in the shawl, the sold woman, the problem being resolved, and not being Rosalind Vane at all. She pressed her palms flat on her knees and breathed and named the other thing too, the one that sat underneath the grief. Fear. Not of Philippa, not of the dinner, not of the uncle or the fraud or the evidence. Fear of what she had been feeling since the conversation in the study, of what she would lose if it broke, of how much it would hurt if this man looked at her with those grey eyes and did not see her. She did not want to need this. She could not afford to need it. Agnes knocked softly. The Duke was asking if she would walk with him in the north garden. She smoothed her dress. She straightened the shawl. She went. The north garden was walled, with an overgrown rose hedge along the east side, and a stone bench that faced the evening light in the west. The Duke was standing when she arrived, not sitting, hands behind his back. He looked at her when she came through the gate, and whatever was in her face made his own face quiet in a specific way. Not sympathy exactly, but presence. He was simply there, fully, without the usual formal distance. "Philippa came to me before she came to you," he said. "She told me you were building evidence against your uncle to increase your standing in this house." Rosalind felt something cold move through her chest. "And what did you say?" she asked. "I said I had commissioned the same inquiry 6 weeks before our wedding, and that you had contributed information I did not have. I said that she was to leave your correspondence alone." He paused. "She did not receive that well." "No," Rosalind agreed. "She did not." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the roses. The light was going gold. "She is afraid," he said finally. "That is not an excuse. I want to be clear that her behaviour is not excused by fear, but I want you to understand it." He turned and looked at her directly. "She has been the woman of this household since Catherine died. She has managed this role for 4 years, and now she is not in that position, and she does not know what she is." "I understand it," Rosalind said. "I do not need it excused." He was quiet again. Then, "I'm sorry," he said. His voice was different, not the Duke's voice, the formal, even register. Something underneath it. "For the position you were placed in, I understood it was an arrangement of necessity. I did not understand that the necessity was this particular and this cruel." She looked at him. "I saw you on the day you arrived," he said, "standing in the entrance hall in August wearing a wool shawl, keeping your back against the wall, and I chose not to ask." He stopped. His jaw tightened. "I chose not to ask because I was afraid of what the answer would require of me." The garden was very quiet. "I am asking now," he said, quietly, directly. She held his gaze for a long time, and then she made the decision, the one that felt like stepping off the edge of something, and she spoke. "It was a strap," she said, "a riding strap. He kept it in the bottom drawer of his desk." The Duke did not move. She kept her eyes on the rose hedge, on the place where the evening light caught the petals near the top. "The first time was the winter after my father died. He told me afterward it would not happen again. He used exactly those words." She stopped for a moment. "By the 2nd year, I understood it was not going to stop. It was too deliberate to be temper. He chose when, and he chose the reason, and he chose the instrument, and he was never once sorry after. That is the thing I have never found words for. Not the pain, the complete absence of regret." She had been right that she had nothing left to cry. Her voice was level. That was the gift of crying beforehand. It cleared the channel so the words could come through without interference. "The shawl," she said. "I started wearing it the spring after the first winter. One of the marks had come too close to the collar line of a day dress, and I was afraid someone would see it and ask questions I could not answer safely. And then it became a habit, a way of knowing that no one could see." She paused. "I wore it here because I did not know yet whether this was a room where it was necessary." The silence afterward was very large. She finally looked at him. His hands, still clasped behind his back, had gone white at the knuckles. His jaw was rigid in the specific way of a man applying considerable effort to staying in one place. He was looking at the ground. "Catherine's father," he said. His voice was thick. "When I understood what was happening in that house, I told myself that removal was enough, that getting her out was the solution." He lifted his eyes. They were raw in a way she had not seen before, open, unguarded, grieving something that 4 years had not finished. "I think about the weeks before she died, whether I moved fast enough, whether I saw clearly enough, and told myself I wasn't sure because certainty would have required action, and action would have required a kind of—" He stopped. "I was afraid of overstepping, of being wrong, of the scene it would create." His jaw tightened hard. "She is dead because I was afraid of a scene." "You do not know that," Rosalind said. "No," he agreed, "but I know that I chose comfort over speed, and I have not made peace with it." She was quiet for a moment. "You could not have known it would be that fast," she said. "Her death. No one could have known." "Perhaps not." He looked at her. "But I could have known sooner about the rest of it. I could have looked at what I was looking at and said what I saw." The evening light was warm and gold, and the overgrown roses were enormous in August, crowding the wall. She held the moment carefully. "This is not that situation," she said. "I am not Catherine." "No," he said. "You are not. And you are not too late." He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she could see, clearly and without any of the usual careful distance between them, that he was afraid. Not of her, of wanting this to be true and being wrong about it, of counting on something that could break. He reached out slowly, and she did not step back, and he took her hand in both of his with a care that was almost formal, as though the gesture required ceremony. They stood like that in the north garden, while the light changed from gold to amber. "The dinner is in 5 days," he said. "I know." "I have asked Hollis to arrange for a specific guest to be present," he said. "Not at the table, in the parlour for the first 2 courses. The county magistrate, Mr. Colton." She understood. "And Mr. Pendlebury?" "I have written to him today. He will come to London with what he has found, and I will receive him the day after the dinner." She looked at him. "You think it will be enough?" "I think," he said carefully, "that when the evidence is read in front of witnesses, there will be nothing for your uncle to argue against." She nodded. Then she said, "I would like to be the one who reads it." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, I think you should be." The letter from Pendlebury arrived the following morning. He had found 2 former church wardens who had raised concerns about the accounts in Gerald Vane's early years and been dismissed. He had located the original pre-Gerald accounts from the bishop's archive, showing the parish in sound financial health. He had witnesses, documentation, and the name of a second solicitor who was prepared to accompany him to verify the chain of evidence. He was ready. Rosalind sat in the library and opened her notebook and wrote the full account from memory. Every discrepancy she had found in the locked ledger books, with dates, columns, and specific amounts, cross-referenced against the official accounts she had seen and the figures she had retained with the precise memory her father had praised when she was 12 years old. She wrote for 4 hours, and she was not tired when she finished. The dinner was on a Friday in August, the 20th, and the guests began arriving by carriage at 5 o'clock. The evening was still warm, the kind of warm that settles into the stone of an old house and holds there after the sun is gone. Rosalind stood in the entrance hall with Mrs. Hatton at her shoulder and received each guest as they came in, using the names she had been studying all week. Lord and Lady Caswell, who were the senior titled couple in the county, and held between them the kind of social authority that made every other guest watch them first. Sir Robert and Lady Merton, with their eldest daughter Cecilia, who was 18 and wide-eyed. Viscount Drabery, with his mother, the Dowager Viscountess, a small, fierce woman of about 70, dressed entirely in black, who spoke very rarely and noticed absolutely everything, whose sharp dark eyes swept the hall the moment she entered and appeared to record every detail for later. 5 more guests, making 12 in all, arranged around a dining table in the great hall that seated 14. Lady Philippa arrived at 5 minutes past 5, with the confidence of someone who had not been explicitly told she was not invited, and therefore considered herself invited. She went directly to her chair, the one she had sat in at every dinner at Blackmere for 4 years, and sat in it and looked at Rosalind across the table with the composed, pleasant expression of someone who is waiting. The Duke, at the head of the table, looked at his sister for one long moment. Philippa looked back. Nothing was said. The dinner began. The first course passed without incident. The conversation moved around the table with the well-oiled ease of people accustomed to these occasions. The summer weather, a recent horse sale, news from the London season just closing. The Duke was present and formal, saying the right things in his low, even voice, occasionally drawing the room in the natural way powerful men do. Rosalind acted as hostess with the skills she had been honing since she was 16, when she had run her father's parish dinners for visiting clergy and local dignitaries. She introduced subjects, bridged silences, drew out the quieter guests. She was aware of Philippa watching her every moment. The Dowager Viscountess caught Rosalind's eye at the end of the first course and held it for a deliberate second, the look of a woman who had been reading tables for 5 decades and missed nothing. Her eyes moved to Philippa and back to Rosalind, and the old woman's mouth moved very slightly at one corner. She knew something was building. She had probably known it since she walked through the door. The second course came and went. The shawl. It had been on her shoulders for 3 weeks without removal. Every guest at the table had noticed. The wool was heavy and the room was warm, and no one had said anything, because no one addresses a duchess about her clothing choices at her own table, not directly, not in this company. No one except a woman who had steamed open a letter, who had been cornered in a garden, who had come to this dinner because she had nothing left to lose, and had decided, in the particular logic of a person who has run out of other options, that destruction was better than retreat. Philippa moved during the third course. She stood smoothly as though reaching for a dish. She moved behind the row of chairs on Rosalind's side of the table, with the unhurried precision of someone who has planned her route. Her hands came to rest on the back of Rosalind's chair, and then they came down to the shawl, and in a single smooth motion she found the pin at the collarbone and pulled. The wool fell away. Every person at the table had an unobstructed view of the back of the Duchess of Blackmere in her white evening dress, and through the thin fabric, visible in the candlelight, was the evidence of what a riding strap can do to a woman's back across years of careful application. Not one mark, not two, a lattice, a record. The silence was absolute. Nothing moved, no chair scraped, no silver rang, no glass was set down. Lord Caswell stared for one moment, and then looked immediately away, jaw rigid, the look of a man cataloguing what he has seen for permanent record. The Dowager Viscountess's hand stopped midway to her wineglass, and stayed there, suspended. Lady Merton's face went white, and then composed itself with considerable effort. Cecilia Merton pressed her lips together so hard they went pale. Mr. Forsyth looked at his plate and did not look up again. Philippa stood behind Rosalind's chair with the shawl in her hands. She had expected something she could mock. She had expected the modesty of a woman ashamed of plainness, or a minor scar, or some small, ordinary imperfection. She had not calculated for this. The triumph she had walked to this chair to collect had lasted less than 2 seconds, and what replaced it was something she could not name quickly enough to control, a kind of arrested horror, and beneath it the understanding that she had, in front of 12 witnesses, done something she could not undo. No one moved. Rosalind sat perfectly still. She was composed. She was composed the way stone is composed, from the inside out, completely, because composure was the one thing that had never been taken from her, no matter what else was. She sat straight in her chair, and she did not look at anyone, and she did not move, and she did not speak. The Duke stood. He stood the way he stood when a room needed to understand something about authority, not fast, not theatrical, just completely, rising to his full height, with the absolute stillness of a man who does not need gestures, because his presence is already the gesture. He looked at Rosalind's back for one moment. The grief was immediate and physical. Catherine 4 years ago, Catherine's father, the specific guilt of a man who had told himself that removal was enough and been wrong, and underneath the grief was something colder and more absolute. He was not going to stand at a distance from something he could see clearly, and tell himself he was uncertain. Not again. Not in this room. He removed his evening coat. He walked the length of the table in silence. Every guest watched. He stopped behind Rosalind's chair and he set the coat across her shoulders with the deliberate precision of someone handling something that matters, adjusting it so that it covered her completely from shoulder to the middle of her back, smoothing the lapels with care. Then he turned to face his sister. The room held its breath. "Leave my house tonight," the Duke said. Philippa had not moved. The shawl was still in her hands. "Marcus," her voice was not pleasant anymore. The pleasantness was entirely gone. "She has been manipulating this household since the day she arrived. She is trying to leave my house tonight." The same words, the same register, not louder, but more solid, the way a foundation is solid. She is the Duchess of Blackmere. He held his sister's gaze, and the 12 guests at the table were so still they might have been painted. "And you have struck the last woman in this house who could not defend herself." Philippa opened her mouth. The look on her brother's face closed it again. She was reading him for the version she knew, the one who had always eventually made room for her, who had always found a way to step back from the edge, who loved her in the specific painful way of someone who has forgiven too many things and keeps forgiving. That version was not present in this room. "You will arrange your things," the Duke said, "and you will leave tonight." Philippa set the shawl on the table. Her hands were not steady. She walked to the door without speaking and went through it, and her footsteps faded down the corridor, and then there was only the sound of 12 people very carefully breathing. Rosalind sat in his coat with her hands folded in her lap. She was composed. She was the most composed person in the room. She would process this later, in private, alone, with the door locked and no witnesses. The grief and the relief and the enormous terrifying thing that had just happened in public on her behalf. Later. The Dowager Viscountess set her wineglass down. "Your Grace," the old woman said, addressing Rosalind in a voice that had the authority of having survived everything and found most of it manageable. I think you should stay exactly where you are." Lord Caswell cleared his throat. "Quite right." The room found its breath slowly, the way a room does after something has broken in it, and the floor has held. The Duke returned to his seat. The dinner resumed with the careful courtesy of people who understand that dignity is required to process certain things, and who are, most of them, genuinely trying. The conversation did not go back to horses. 15 minutes later, Mr. Hollis appeared in the doorway and caught the Duke's eye and gave one small nod. The Duke excused himself for 3 minutes, long enough to receive the folder that Hollis passed him in the corridor. When he came back to the table, the folder was in his hand. "Before we move to the final course," he said, addressing the table with the ease of someone who has been preparing for this moment, "there is a matter I believe this company's attention is warranted on. Several of you will know the name Gerald Vane." Lord Caswell frowned. "Rector at Ashbourne?" "Was," the Duke said. "He presented to this house, and to the bishop's office, an arrangement resolving a £4,000 parish debt through the marriage settlement." He opened the folder and set the first document on the table. What neither this house nor the bishop's office was told is that £4,000 was not the true figure. It was the figure that could no longer be hidden. The actual amount removed from St. Clement's parish, across 12 years, is £11,432. The room was quiet. Lord Caswell, who was a justice of the peace, reached for the document without being asked. "My wife identified the specific pattern of falsification in the accounts," the Duke said. He looked at Rosalind now, and there was nothing careful or controlled in the way he looked at her. It was direct and warm and entirely deliberate, and every person at the table saw it. She identified it years ago and kept records. Those records, combined with the work of the firm, Brant and Morrow, and the testimony of 2 former churchwardens obtained through Mr. Arthur Pendlebury of Bath, constitute a full accounting. Rosalind took the second document from the folder. She read clearly, naming the figures, the dates, the specific discrepancies she had found in the hidden ledger books, the cross-references to the official accounts, the pattern of alteration that constituted 12 years of deliberate fraud against a parish and the families who supported it. She read without trembling. She read the way her father had taught her, clearly, factually, with attention to what the numbers proved and what they implied. She read for 7 minutes, and when she finished, the table was completely silent. Lord Caswell looked up from the documents in front of him. "You kept these records yourself," he said. "My father taught me to read accounts," she said. "I found the discrepancy when I was 19. I did not know at the time how to present it. I know now." The Dowager Viscountess was watching her with the expression of someone adding a final entry to a long-held opinion. Lord Caswell nodded once. "Your father would have been proud," he said. The Duke looked at Hollis in the doorway, and Hollis opened the door wider, and Magistrate Colton of the county walked in. He had been invited to dinner. He had been seated in the parlour for the first 2 courses. He had been given a copy of the documents that morning. He had not been placed at the table by accident. Gerald Vane, the magistrate informed the room, had been located in Ashbourne that afternoon, and was currently in custody with the county constable. He would appear before the assizes in the autumn. The charge was criminal fraud against the Church of England. The penalty, given the scale and duration, was transportation. Rosalind sat very still in the Duke's coat and heard the sentence. The weight she had been carrying, the 4 years of knowing and having no standing to say, the 12 months since April of carrying the fraud in her notebook and her body and her silence, that weight left her in a way she could feel physically, like something untied, like a knot that has been held so long the hands forget they are holding it until the moment they let go. The Dowager Viscountess raised her glass. "To the Duchess of Blackmere," she said, in a voice that went to every corner of the room, "who appears to have been the most capable person in this county for quite some time, and has been gracious enough not to mention it." The table raised their glasses. Lord Caswell said, "Hear, hear." Rosalind did not speak. She did not need to. She was heard. The guests were gone by 10. The last carriage left, and the house went quiet, and Rosalind sat alone in her room for a long time. She did not cry immediately. She sat on the edge of the bed the way she had sat on the edge of the bed in the rectory in April. But it was different now because the weight was different. Not the weight of a future being decided without her, but the weight of something finally over. She let herself feel it. Relief. real and physical, like breathing fully for the first time in months, grief for the years before it, a shaking in her hands that had nothing to do with fear, and underneath all of it, the thing she had been most afraid to feel, something warm and certain, connected to a man who had walked the length of a table in silence and covered her with both hands, and then turned around and burned down the room on her behalf. She was not going to call it love yet. She was going to call it trust, because she understood the value of trust precisely, and it was the more accurate word for what she felt right now, the specific, fragile recognition that she was known by someone, and that this was real. After a while, she reached for the shawl. It was folded on the chair by the window as always. She held it for a moment. Then she set it down and did not reach for the pin. 2 months later, on a morning in October when the trees along the North Drive had gone gold, Rosalind stood in the small chapel at Blackmere and married Marcus Ashford a second time. The first ceremony had been a contract. This one was something else. Agnes and Mr. Hollis stood as witnesses. The chapel was cold in the way old stone is cold in October, and someone had put late roses from the north garden in 2 vases by the altar, small and slightly past their best and exactly right. The Duke said the words looking at her, and she said the words looking at him, and neither of them looked away. Afterward, they walked back through the garden, the north one, past the overgrown rose hedge and the stone bench. He stopped on the path and took both her hands and held them and looked at her for a long, quiet moment. She had seen him look at her in the entrance hall and in the study and across the dinner table, through all the careful weeks of managing an arrangement. This was different. He was looking at her the way he had not permitted himself to look, without the glass of formality between them, without the control that had been his register for so long it had started to look like his face. She could see the grief for Catherine still there, but behind it, entirely separate from it, something that had nothing to do with the past, something that was about her and the library catalogue, and the 11-minute dinner conversation, and the North Garden in August, and the coat. "Rosalind," he said. Her name, in his voice, said like something he had been keeping with care. "Marcus," she said. He leaned his forehead against hers and she held onto his hands, and for a while neither of them spoke. The October light was thin and clear and the roses were nearly over, and the silence between them was the best kind of silence, the kind that doesn't need anything added to it. They stood there for a long time. Lady Philippa appeared at the winter assembly in December. She came alone, without her usual arrangement of friends and social architecture around her, and she stood in the middle of the assembly room floor and asked for the room's attention. The Dowager Viscountess was present, her sharp eyes already fixed on Philippa before she spoke. Lord and Lady Caswell were present. Lady Merton was present. A dozen more of the county. Rosalind was standing near the fire with Marcus's hand resting at the small of her back. Philippa looked at her. She held the look, not flinching, not looking for permission, simply looking, with an expression that was costing her something considerable. "I wish to apologize," she said. Her voice did not shake. "For what I did at the dinner in August. I was cruel, and I was wrong, and I ask, publicly, for forgiveness." She went down on one knee on the assembly room floor. The room was very still. The fire crackled. The candles in the chandelier above moved slightly in the air that comes when a room is holding its breath. "Get up," Rosalind said, quietly, clearly. "Lady Philippa." Philippa stood. "You may call on us," Rosalind said, "when you are ready." Philippa nodded once, a precise small motion, and walked to the door. The Dowager Viscountess from across the room caught Rosalind's eye and gave a single, slow, definitive nod. That was enough. 3 years later, in November, the library at Blackmere was fully catalogued for the first time in its existence. The index ran to 3 volumes, bound in brown leather, shelved in the estate office. The household accounts had been overhauled. 4 supplier contracts had been renegotiated. And in an attic chest that had been locked for 40 years, Rosalind had found a cache of the 4th Duchess of Blackmere's correspondence, dating from the 1770s, that turned out to be historically significant enough that a professor from Oxford came to Blackmere in September and spent 3 days going through it with barely suppressed excitement. On an evening in late November, the library fire was going. The curtains were drawn against the dark, and their daughter Eleanor, 2.5 years old, with her father's grey eyes and her mother's composure, was asleep on the wide chair near the fire, with her head on a library cushion and her small shoes on the floor beside the chair where she had stepped out of them. The second child was due in February. Rosalind had decided, privately, that she would like another daughter, though she was prepared to accept the outcome with equanimity. Marcus was reading at the desk. She was reading in the chair across from Eleanor. The fire made the room warm and gold, and the silence between them was the warm, occupied silence of two people who have been in the same room long enough to know they want to keep being there. She looked up at him, and he looked up at her. He smiled. Not the ghost of one. Not the involuntary, almost smile that she had filed away in the first weeks and treasured privately. A real one, easy and warm, the kind that had taken 9 months to arrive and then stayed. She had come to Blackmere Castle in August, wearing a wool shawl in a heat that made no sense for wool. She had stood in the entrance hall with her back to the wall and learned the dimensions of her cage. She had been sold to settle a debt by a man who had never once considered that she was anything other than a liability to be resolved. She was not a liability. She was the Duchess of Blackmere, and the library was catalogued, and the fraud had been answered, and her father's work had been honoured, and her husband was reading across from her in the firelight, and Eleanor was asleep with her shoes off, and there was a child coming in February. Rosalind Vane had been told, in a variety of ways, by a variety of people over 23 years, that she was without standing, without value, without the kind of weight that makes a person matter in the rooms they walk into. She had never believed it. She had just been waiting for the room that would prove her right. She was home. If you stayed until the end of this story, thank you. Please subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a new chapter. I would love to know what you thought. Leave your rating, 1 to 10, in the comments below, and tell me where you are watching from today. We have listeners from every corner of the world, and every single comment is something I genuinely look forward to reading. Thank you for being here. See you in the next one.